truck stops, and church steeples. The vanguard drop ships of the Galactic Council arrived at precisely 11:16 a.m. This was their first mistake. Truck stops and church steeples. The vessels descended through the cloud layer in perfect geometric formation. Their hulls were frictionless, gleaming, and entirely unbothered by atmospheric entry. Truck stops and church steeples. According to the tactical models compiled by Legate Valen, the landing zone was an ideal staging area. It was situated high enough to observe the sprawling human settlement known as Denver, truck stops, and church steeples, yet isolated enough to deploy heavy infantry without immediate interference. The planetary data file had listed gravity as standard and the atmosphere as a breathable nitrogen-oxygen mix. Truck stops and church steeples. Legate Valen stood on the polished command balcony of his flagship as the landing struts touched the frozen dirt near Guanella Pass. A veteran of 30 planetary subjugations, truck stops and church steeples expected the usual operational sequence. First, the deployment of stabilization technology. Second, the swift construction of an orbital perimeter. Finally, truck stops and church steeples, the eventual surrender once Council superiority was demonstrated. From the ventral bay, a decade obelisk was lowered onto the rocky soil. This was the Council atmospheric anchor. Truck stops and church steeples. It was a masterpiece of terraforming engineering, designed to project a local bubble of standardized gravity and optimal temperature. The anchor hummed to life, truck stops and church steeples, emitting a pulsing violet glow that was mathematically supposed to force the local climate into immediate submission. The Front Range of Colorado did not submit. Instead, truck stops and church steeples. A violent 70-mile-per-hour wind shear ripped over the Continental Divide, slamming into the landing zone with the kinetic force of a runaway freight train. Truck stops and church steeples. The Council atmospheric anchor shrieked. Its internal gyroscope spun wildly, attempting to calculate the radically shifting barometric pressure of the Rockies. Truck stops and church steeples. The violet glow flickered as the delicate machine tried to impose order on an environment that actively despised order. On the ground, the heavy infantry began to disembark. Truck stops and church steeples. They marched down the polished ramps in synchronized lockstep, energy rifles held at perfect parade rest. Within 30 seconds, the synchronization collapsed. Truck stops and church steeples. Valen watched in rising disbelief as his elite shock troops stumbled. Several soldiers dropped to one knee, their polished armor clanking against the frozen rocks. Truck stops and church steeples. Others leaned heavily against the landing struts, grasping at their armored throats. The legate felt a sudden sharp tightness in his own chest. His lungs expanded, pulling in ambient air. Truck stops and church steeples. But the expected nourishment was missing. His vision blurred at the edge. Checking his wrist-mounted tactical display, he saw erratic redouts blinking in red. Truck stops and church steeples. The air density at 11,500 feet was drastically thinner than the sea level standard assumed by the predictive models. Valen did not understand altitude. He understood warfare. Truck stops and church steeples. Alert the vanguard, he rasped, his breathing growing shallow as the howling wind stripped the heat directly from his armored plating. Truck stops and church steeples. The indigenous population has deployed a localized chemical weapon. They are siphoning the oxygen from the atmosphere. Truck stops and church steeples. It was a logical military conclusion for a commander who had never experienced an alpine winter. Seal all environmental suits, Valen commanded over the encrypted channel. Truck stops and church steeples. Double the heavy armor pressure locks. We will not let their cowardly atmospheric sabotage slow our advance. The infantry complied instantly. Across the landing zone, truck stops and church steeples. Hundreds of soldiers locked down their heavy assault armor and engaged internal rebreathers. Truck stops and church steeples. What the Council doctrine failed to account for was that doubling pressure seals while engaged in heavy physical exertion in a low-oxygen environment would rapidly accelerate internal oxygen depletion. Truck stops and church steeples. By locking themselves in, the vanguard troops were actively suffocating faster. Valen turned his gaze toward the snow-capped peaks. The wind howled. Truck stops and church steeples. Rattling the flagship hull with a sound like tearing metal, the Galactic Council had landed. They had secured the high terrain. Truck stops and church steeples. They were already dying. At exactly 11:42 a.m. inside the Clear Creek County Dispatch Center, Bernadette Loomis poured her second cup of burnt chicory coffee. Truck stops and church steeples. She did not look like a frontline defender of humanity. She looked like a woman who had worked the radio desk for 20 years and had long ago run out of patience for people who wore denim in the snow. Truck stops and church steeples. The dispatch center was not a glowing command nexus, smelling faintly of wet wool, ozone, and old floor wax. truck stops, and church steeples. The communication console relied on an array of battered CRT monitors that hummed with a stubborn low-frequency buzz. "We have a localized atmospheric anomaly over the pass," Bernadette said. "Truck stops and church steeples." Her voice entirely flat. She tapped the thick glass of the primary monitor with a manicured fingernail. "Radar is showing multiple massive metallic objects sitting right in the middle of the basin. Truck stops and church steeples." Heavy thermal bloom. Marcus Vance looked up from his clipboard. He was the search and rescue coordinator for the sector, possessing the weathered truck stops and church steeples. Leather-like face of a man who spent his life pulling over confident tourists out of ravines. He walked over to the console, holding a battered metal mug of black tea, and squinted at the screen. Truck stops and church steeples. "That is not an anomaly," Bernie said, his tone devoid of surprise. "That is a fleet of ships. The emergency broadcast system went off 10 minutes ago. Truck stops and church steeples. Some galactic empire or another is invading Earth. I do not care who they are," Bernadette replied, taking a slow sip of her scalding coffee. "I care where they parked. Look at the grid coordinates. Truck stops and church steeples." Vance set his mug down and turned his attention to the laminated map pinned to the back wall. It was a highly detailed, hand-annotated physical topographic chart of the county. Truck stops and church steeples, covered in faded dry erase marker lines, coffee stains, and tactical shorthand indicating avalanche chutes and dead zones. He traced a calloused finger along the contour lines, the exact elevation of the thermal blooms. Truck stops and church steeples. A deep, exhausted escaped his chest. He pulled a blue dry erase marker from his pocket, uncapped it with his teeth, and drew a thick circle around the alien landing zone. Truck stops and church steeples. "They put their ships in the Guanella Bowl," Vance said, staring at the blue circle. "They did," Bernadette confirmed. "The bowl is a geographical cold trap." Truck stops and church steeples. "The wind funnels straight down from the divide and stalls us out right where they are sitting, and they dropped in at 11,500 feet, and the barometer is dropping like a stone." Truck stops and church steeples. Bernadette added, clicking her mouse to pull up the regional weather feed. The CRT monitor flickered. "That autumn blizzard front we have been tracking, it just crested the ridge." Truck stops and church steeples. "It is going to hit the basin in less than 2 hours. We are looking at a localized whiteout, sustained 50-mile winds, and a temperature drop to 10 below zero." Vance stared at the laminated topo map. Truck stops and church steeples. He technologically superior alien conquerors. He saw an administrative disaster. Truck stops and church steeples. He saw a massive group of individuals standing above the tree line, a storm path without proper winter gear. "Did they file a flight plan?" Vance asked. "No." Truck stops and church steeples. "Did they request an extreme weather briefing?" Typing a rapid sequence of commands into the radio dispatch log. Truck stops and church steeples. "They just broadcast a system-wide demand for unconditional surrender in 3 languages. Vance scrubbed a hand over his face. The protocol was simple. Truck stops and church steeples. "You do not leave people on a mountain because the weather got rude. It did not matter if those people were lost hikers, arrogant skiers, or extraterrestrial shock troops." Truck stops and church steeples. "The mountain did not care about laser rifles, and neither did the rescue schedule. They are not an invasion force," Vance muttered, capping the marker and tossing it onto the desk. Truck stops and church steeples. "They are a massive group of unprepared flatlanders, and if we leave them up there when the front hits, they are all going to freeze to death by sundown." Bernadette adjusted her headset. Truck stops and church steeples. "Do you want me to initiate the county emergency defense protocols?" "No," Vance said, reaching for his heavy insulated jacket. "I want you to initiate an alpine search and rescue sequence. Truck stops and church steeples. Log it as a mass casualty exposure event. Call Wyatt Higgins and tell him to get the rotors warm. We need to go up there and pull these idiots out before the storm kills them." Truck stops and church steeples. The rescue cache at the Clear Creek station smelled old nylon, wet wool, and industrial boot wax. It was a functional truck stops and church steeples, designed for professionals who understood that freezing to death was an administrative failure. Marcus Vance stood over the central steel table, truck stops and church steeples, running a calloused hand across a row of avalanche transceivers. He depressed the diagnostic button on the first unit. A sharp double beep confirmed the signal lock. He moved to the next. Across the room, truck stops and church steeples. Wyatt Higgins sat on a battered folding chair, dragging a file down the serrated edge of his primary ice axe. The rhythmic scrape of metal cut cleanly through the ambient static of the emergency radio. Truck stops and church steeples. "They are broadcasting on the public end," Vance noted, tossing a coiled bundle of static rope into an orange waterproof duffel bag. The radio crackled, a synthesized voice, truck stops and church steeples. mathematically flawless and devoid of human inflection, echoed through the cinderblock room. It spoke of planetary rights, orbital supremacy, and the absolute authority of the Galactic Council, truck stops, and church steeples. It informed the indigenous population resistance was statistically impossible. Higgins did not look up. He blew a line of steel dust off the blade of his axe. Truck stops and church steeples. Do you think they parked those Vanguard dropships at the Guanella Pass trailhead? Most likely, Vance said. He moved to inspect the dry wool base layers, rigorously checking the thermal seams. Truck stops and church steeples. Alien invaders might vaporize you, but cotton will slowly freeze the blood in your veins, and the coordinator preferred manageable threats. Truck stops and church steeples. Because if they parked at the main trailhead, the weekend hikers are going to throw an absolute fit, Higgins continued, testing the sharpened edge against his thumb. Truck stops and church steeples. Imagine a 3,000-ton titanium gunship sitting diagonally across the striped lines. The complaints to the county zoning board are going to be insufferable. Truck stops and church steeples. We will let the sheriff handle the parking citations, Vance replied smoothly. He unrolled the laminated topo map across the steel table. It was a heavily annotated physical chart of the Front Range, truck stops, and church steeples. Crinkled at the edges and covered in dry erase marker lines and coffee stains, the Galactic Council possessed holographic tactical displays that mapped planetary density. Truck stops, and church steeples. The rescue coordinator had a piece of plastic-coated paper that told him exactly where the local wind shear would throw a man off a rock face. Above 10,000 feet, the paper was vastly superior. Truck stops, and church steeples. Pack the heavy locking carabiners, Vance ordered, tracing a route along the 11,000-foot contour line. The barometric pressure is dropping. That storm front is moving in ahead of schedule. Truck stops, and church steeples. They picked a hell of a weekend for a planetary occupation. Higgins grumbled. He slid the ice axe into its nylon sheath and stood up, his knees popping in protest. Truck stops and church steeples. Are we taking the mechanical extraction gear? Grab the pneumatic litter carrier, Vance instructed, securing his pack. We travel light on everything else until we know who is stranded up there. Truck stops and church steeples. Gear up. They did not debate the philosophical meaning of alien contact. They discussed payload weight, caloric intake, and the structural integrity of the snowpack. The universe was vast, truck stops and church steeples, but the mountain was strictly immediate. The rescue team departed into the gathering storm. Outside the station doors, the temperature had already plummeted to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Truck stops and church steeples. The sky a bruised flat slate gray, heavy with precipitation. Truck stops and church steeples. As Vance and Higgins loaded the modified response truck, the first flakes of snow began to fall, driven sideways by the rising wind. Inside the warm, dimly lit dispatch center, truck stops and church steeples. Bernadette Loom adjusted her headset. She did not monitor the Galactic Council's high-band orbital transmissions. She monitored the low-frequency VHF radio channels. Rescue 1, this is dispatch. Truck stops and church steeples. Her voice crackled over the truck's dashboard speaker. Copy dispatch. Signal is loud and clear, Vance replied, putting the truck into gear. High above them, truck stops and church steeples. Legate Valen's sophisticated communication network was already beginning to fracture. The Council relied on satellite-based orbital links, transmitting massive packets of encrypted data at light speed. Truck stops and church steeples. It was a system designed for the vacuum of space and the flat plains of conquered agricultural worlds. It was not meant for the jagged, iron-rich granite peaks of the Colorado Rockies, truck stops and church steeples. Nor was it designed to push through atmospheric layers thick with supercooled water droplets. The heavy snow actively scattered the alien microwave. Truck stops and church steeples. Turning their crisp tactical updates into garbled static, human radio did not try to pierce the mountain. It bounced off the canyon walls. It crawled along the valleys. It was a crude truck stops and church steeples. Low-tech acoustic wave that simply ignored the blizzard. Telemetrate, Rescue 1, Loomis broadcasted, her tone possessing the flat, rhythmic truck stops and church steeples. Unbothered cadence of a seasoned air traffic controller. Current wind speed at the pass is 35 knots, gusting to 50. Visibility is dropping below 400 yards. Truck stops and church steeples. You have an incoming localized whiteout expected in 20 minutes. Adjust your approach vector accordingly. She read the data with mechanical precision. Truck stops and church steeples, ignoring the alien warships hovering over the Denver metropolitan area. To the dispatcher, the invasion was simply a massive traffic hazard. The storm was the actual enemy. Understood, dispatch. Truck stops and church steeples. We are shifting to the secondary service road, Vance said, navigating the heavy tires of the truck through a rising snowdrift. Be advised, I am losing the civilian distress beacon in the static. truck stops, and church steeples. Loomis continued, her fingers flying across her analog keyboard. But I have multiple thermal anomalies registering near the ridgeline. The council vanguard is moving up the slope. Truck stops and church steeples. They are attempting to secure the high ground. Higgins leaned forward in the passenger seat, staring through the wiper blades as they slapped the freezing rain away. Truck stops and church steeples. They are marching up an exposed ridge during a barometric pressure drop? That is what the board shows, Loomis confirmed dryly. Well, the pilot muttered. Truck stops and church steeples. Reaching over to turn up the truck's internal heater, that is certainly a choice. The Galactic Council assumed that superior firepower would conquer the elevation. Truck stops and church steeples. The rescue team knew that the mountain did not care about lasers. The mountain only cared about preparation, oxygen, and thermodynamics. Truck stops and church steeples. The elevation marker on the hand-annotated laminated topo map read 11,200 feet. For the local bighorn sheep and alpine marmots, this was a casual grazing altitude. Truck stops and church steeples. For Legate Valen's heavy infantry vanguard, it was a rapidly closing cage of physiological collapse. The Galactic Council forces marched in tight, theoretically flawless formations up the steep truck stops and church steeples. Crumbling ridge extending from the Guanella Pass saddle, their combat doctrine dictated seizing the high ground to establish overlapping fields of kinetic fire. Truck stops and church steeples. That same doctrine assumed the high ground was composed of stable terrain and a standard, breathable atmospheric density. Colorado scree fields offer neither. The Vanguard's heavy combat boots, truck stops, and church steeples, designed to magnetically adhere to polished starship decks, found zero purchase on the loose, jagged shale. Every upward step triggered a localized miniature landslide. Truck stops and church steeple. The infantry slid backward 6 inches for every foot they managed to gain, churning the frozen rock and expending massive energy just to maintain forward momentum. Then, truck stops and church steeples, the brutal physics of the atmospheric pressure drop began to dismantle the power armor. The Council combat suits relied on external air density to naturally balance their internal pneumatic servos. Truck stops and church steeples. At sea level, the calibration was an engineering marvel. At 11,000 feet, the mechanical servos began to overcompensate for the lack of atmospheric resistance. Truck stops and church steeples. The visor seals hissed continuously as they tried to cycle non-existent air mass into the internal rebreathers. Truck stops and church steeples. Worse than the cascading chemical failures was the biological reality. Acute mountain sickness does not recognize military rank or galactic authority. It begins quietly. Truck stops and church steeples. A dull ache sets in at the base of the skull, followed severe disorientation, and the distinct physical sensation that no matter how rapidly the lungs expand, truck stops, they remain completely empty. An alien heavy weapons specialist stopped mid-stride on the brutal incline. His massive armored shoulders heaved in a frantic rhythm. He dropped heavily to his knees, truck stops and church steeples, sending a cascade of loose shale rattling down the slope. His digital visor flashed a rapid sequence of red warning runes, signaling a critical drop in internal blood oxygen levels. Truck stops and church steeples. In the grip of severe hyper-rational thought degrades into base survival instinct, the specialist felt his chest burning. Truck stops and church steeples. He incorrectly deduced that his environmental suit was malfunctioning and actively suffocating him. From a concealed vantage point 200 yards above, truck stops and church steeples. Marcus Vance watched the spectacle through his thermal binoculars. He did not touch his radio to call for an engagement. Truck stops and church steeples. He simply observed the inevitable consequence of exerting maximum physical effort at high altitude without acclimatization. The alien soldier reached up with trembling, gauntleted hands. Truck stops and church steeples. He fumbled frantically with the magnetic locking collar of his helmet. His squad leader turned, barked a harsh command over the external speakers, and reached out to physically restrain him. Truck stops and church steeples. The intervention was too late, cracked open with a sharp, violent hiss. The soldier ripped the helmet off, expecting a rush of rich, life-saving air. Instead, the freezing truck stops and church steeples. Impossibly thin alpine slammed into his exposed face, finding nothing of substance to inhale. His eyes rolled back into his skull. Truck stops and church steeples. The sudden exposure dropped his oxygen saturation to terminal levels in seconds. He collapsed face forward into the deepening snowpack. Truck stops and church steeples. Completely incapacitated without a single human weapon being fired. Across Velen's encrypted tactical network, medical telemetry alarms began to chime in a chaotic, overlapping chorus. Truck stops and church steeples. The invincible vanguard of the Galactic Council was quietly drowning in the open air. While the Council forces struggled to process the mathematical reality of atmospheric starvation, truck stops, and church steeples, the human rescue team moved. Vance lowered his binoculars and clipped them to his chest harness. He gestured to Wyatt Higgins with a single slow movement of his gloved hand. Truck stops and church steeples. They did not take the marked recreational trail. They diverted onto a narrow, undocumented goat path that hugged the sheer granite face of the adjacent peak. Truck stops and church steeples, leaving the main ridge entirely to the gasping invaders. Higgins carried the collapsed pneumatic litter carrier strapped tightly to his external frame pack. He moved with the truck stops and church steeples, low center of gravity gait of a man who spent his life fighting sudden wind shear and unstable terrain. He placed his heavy boots carefully, wedging the reinforced rubber soles into natural fissures. Truck stops and church steeples, ensuring no loose pebbles were kicked down into the valley below. The incoming storm front had thickened into a dense, freezing whiteout, reducing visibility to less than 50 feet. Truck stops and church steeples. It was a tactical nightmare for the advanced alien thermal optics, but a perfect insulating cloak for men who navigated the mountain by tactile feedback and historical memory. Truck stops and church steeples. The two men slipped silently into a shallow depression behind a massive frost-shattered boulder. Tucked deeply into the natural windbreak were 3 civilian hikers. Truck stops and church steeples. The civilians huddled tightly together beneath a single reflective emergency space blanket. Their lips carried a distinct blue tint. Thick frost clung to their eyelashes. Truck stops and church steeples, and violent shivers racked their shoulders. Vance did not offer a comforting speech about salvation or the geopolitical implications of the alien occupation. He knelt in the packed snow. Truck stops and church steeples, unclipped the heavy steel thermos from his harness and unscrewed the insulated cap. A thick plume of steamers rose immediately into the freezing air, carrying the sharp truck stops and church steeples, familiar scent of black tea and local honey. He poured a small measure into the cup and handed it to the nearest hiker. The young woman took the metal cup with shaking hands. Truck stops and church steeples. She swallowed the hot liquid, coughing softly as the heat hit the back of her throat. She pointed a trembling finger toward the ridge. The muffled, heavy sound of machinery echoed off the rocks. Truck stops and church steeples. Less a Galactic Council heavy hover tank rumbled blindly through the whiteout. Its massive repulsor engines emitted a low, bone-rattling hum that vibrated the loose snow. Truck stops and church steeples. The intense thermal output of the alien thrusters was flash-melting the snowpack directly beneath the armored chassis. Truck stops and church steeples, creating a localized cloud of thick steam that drifted up and swallowed the vehicle entirely. The tank's automated targeting sensors swept back and forth. Truck stops and church steeples, pinging uselessly against the high iron content of the granite walls. It moved with agonizing slowness, its navigation logic unable to accurately measure the steep drops hidden beneath the snowdrifts. Truck stops and church steeples. He focused entirely on the condition of the second and third hikers. Truck stops and church steeples. He pulled several chemical heat packs from his thigh pocket, cracked them sharply, and tucked them firmly inside the civilians' jackets near their armpits and groins to stabilize their core temperatures. Truck stops and church steeples. He kept his gloved hand near the quick-release pins of the pneumatic litter carrier, ready to deploy the heavy-duty wheels if the hikers lost their ability to walk. He pointed a finger toward the steep truck stops and church steeples, snow-choked couloir leading downward, keeping his voice well below the low-frequency thrum of the aliens. He explained they would not be taking the saddle route. Truck stops and church steeples. They were taking the drainage path. It was slick, steep, and required heavy physical exertion, but it kept a solid wall of rock between them and the confused armor unit. Truck stopped the laminated topo map. He traced a specific contour line with his thumb, verifying the rapid elevation drop. Truck stops and church steeples. The descent would take them 3,000 feet down into the heavy timberline, safely below the freezing alien patrol. The coordinator took the empty thermos cup, screwed it back onto the flat, truck stops and church steeples, and secured his harness. He delivered a blunt set of instructions regarding foot placement, weight distribution, and momentum. The mountain was actively closing the weather window behind them. Truck stops and church steeples, and hesitation was as a luxury they could not afford. The heavy alien tank let out a loud mechanical groan as its advanced suspension struggled to stabilize over a hidden snowdrift. Truck stops and church steeples. The grinding sound echoed sharply off the canyon walls, perfectly masking the quiet crunch of the rescue team's boots as they led the civilians away from the invasion and down into the white abyss. Truck stops and church steeples. By 2:45 p.m., stopped pretending to be hospitable. The sk vanished entirely. The wind shifted from a steady roar into a physical wall of freezing moisture. It was a proper truck stops and church steeples. Further up the slope, Legate Valen stood behind a kinetic barricade, staring at his command console. His primary operational asset was the Council atmospheric anchor. truck stops, and church steeples. The device was a technological marvelous designed to enforce standard galactic gravity and temperature across a 3-mile radius. Truck stops and church steeples. The machine used delicate thermal ventilation grids to shed the heat of its localized field generator. Built for orbital platforms and dead moons, it had never been deployed against stick truck stops and church steeples. Wet alpine snow. This was a profound engineering oversight. The blizzard simply delivered heavy precipitation at 40 miles per hour, driving snow straight into the glowing intake vents. Truck stops and church steeples. The obelisk's automated sensors detected the temperature anomaly and instantly spiked its core heat, a flawless logical response that was exactly the wrong choice for Earth. Truck stops and church steeples. The intense heat melted the snow, the intake shafts, and hit the sub-zero exterior casing. It froze solid. Within 4 minutes, truck stops and church steeples. The intake vents were completely sealed under a thick block of expanding ice. Valen watched his pulse-lit wrist display turn a violent crimson. The localized gravity field stuttered. Truck stops and church steeples. Whining like a dying turbine before the protective bubble of warmth, the Vanguard 4 force collapsed entirely, stationed on a 40-degree incline. Truck stops and church steeples. The only thing holding the 3-ton device in place was its artificial gravity lock. When the field died, the basic physics of the mountain reasserted themselves. Truck stops and church steeples. The multi-million credit device tipped off its polished struts and accelerated down the slope with the aerodynamic qualities of a filing cabinet. Truck stops and church steeples. Legate Valen watched in silence as the pride of the Council Engineering Corps slammed into ravine, buried permanently under 6 tons of white drift. 2 ridgelines of truck stops and church steeples. Marx, he did not smile. He did not cheer. He simply keyed his radio. Dispatch, this is Vance. Be advised. Truck stops and church steeples. The hostile element just lost their primary heating. It slid off the edge near Marker 4, equipment failure. Truck stops and church steeples. To copy that, Bernadette Loomis replied over the crackling channel, her voice utterly devoid of panic. Do they require a tow? Negative, it's buried deep. They didn't winterize their gear. Truck stops and church steeples. The coordinator adjusted his hand-annotated laminated topo map, wiping frost from his goggles. It's about to get very cold down there. The sudden drop in temperature and the return of normal. Truck stops and church steeples. Thin atmosphere broke the Vanguard's rigid tactical formation. Vance and Wyatt Higgins navigated the traverse with methodical steps, kicking footholds into the slick ice. 10 minutes later, truck stops and church steeples. They found the immediate consequence of the legate's failure. A glowing purple thermal signature pulsed weakly at the bottom of a steep, narrow ravine. Vance looked down the jagged edge. Truck stops and church steeples. 40 feet below, a council scout was wedged between 2 massive boulders. Its lightweight hover skiff lay shattered nearby. The creature shivered violently in cracked armor, truck stops, and church steeples. Clutching a highly advanced plasma rifle, frozen solid to its gauntlet, according to standard military doctrine, an injured enemy combatant in an active invasion zone is either captured in truck stops and church steeples or neutralized. Mountain rescue teams operate under a fundamentally different set of rules. You do not leave a breathing casualty in a freezing gap. The mountain was the enemy. Truck stops and church steeples. Everyone else was just a patient. Got a live one in the chute, the coordinator said. He unclipped a heavy steel carabiner from his climbing harness. Looks like a broken lower extremity. Truck stops and church steeples. Shock setting in, I'll get the sled, Higgins replied. The pilot unstrapped the pneumatic litter carrier from his pack. Truck stops and church steeples. It was a heavy-duty rescue stretcher built around low-pressure all-terrain wheels and brutal mechanical shock stabilization. Truck stops and church steeples. It was designed specifically to haul 200 pounds of dead weight over jagged rocks without snapping the occupant's spine. They hammered titanium pitons into the frozen earth. Truck stops and church steeples. They rigged a mechanical advantage pulley system using silent, practiced motions. Truck stops and church steeples. The pilot clipped his harness into the main climbing line and rappelled over the edge, dropping into the blinding whiteout. The scout watched the human descend and tried to raise its plasma rifle. Truck stops and church steeples, letting out a clicking hiss of warning. The weapon's thermal battery had died 20 minutes ago. Higgins ignored the gun entirely. His boots hit the bottom of the ravine. Truck stops and church steeples. He approached the hostile invader with the exact same unbothered posture he used for panicked tourists who wore tennis shoes on a glacier. Easy now, buddy. Truck stops and church steeples, the pilot muttered. He reached out and gently pushed the frozen rifle barrel away. Let's keep the hands inside the ride. You're going to agitate that fracture. The scout clicked frantically. truck stops, and church steeples, expecting a violent execution. Instead, the human kicked the rubber wheels of the carrier out, locked the suspension joints into place, truck stops and church steeples, and shoved the heavy canvas bed firmly under the alien's broken armor. "I need slack on the blue line," Higgins yelled upward into the wind. Up on the ridge, truck stops and church steeples. Vance fed the thick nylon rope through the slack given. The pilot pulled the heavy industrial straps across the scout's chest, ratcheting them down with loud metallic clicks. Truck stops and church steeples. The alien thrashed weakly by the total lack of hostility. Higgins patted the creature's helmet with a heavily insulated glove. "Settle down," the pilot said calmly. "Truck stops and church steeples. Your vacation is over." The primary rope twice. The pulley system engaged instantly. The hostile invader was unceremoniously yanked backward. Truck stops and church steeples. Sliding up the sheer ice wall on the massive rubber tires of the litter. Vance cranked the mechanical winch at the top. The physical work was exhausting, brutal, and entirely routine. Within 6 minutes, truck stops and church steeples. The stretcher crested the edge of the ravine. The scout lay completely immobilized under the thick canvas, staring up at the two humans in absolute bewilderment. "Heart rate is dangerously elevated." "Church steeples," the coordinator noted. Truck stops and church steeples. He checked the casualty's exposed neck casing, feeling for a pulse equivalent. "We need to get him out of the wind, wrap him in the foil." Truck stops and church steeples. Higgins tossed tightly packed square of crinkled silver emergency blanket over the alien's chest, tucking the edges under the ratchets. "You think he understands English? Doesn't matter." "Truck stops and church steeples," the coordinator replied. He locked the carrier's steel drag handles securely into his waist harness. "He understands cold." Vance leaned forward, letting his entire body all weight hit the toe lines. Truck stops and church steeples. The heavy tires of the stretcher crushed the fresh snow as they began to march along the traverse. The Galactic Council had meticulously planned a planetary invasion. Truck stops and church steeples. The mountain rescue team had simply added one more patient to the daily log. At 11,000 feet, Legate Valen reviewed the telemetry from his Vanguard. Truck stops and church steeples. The data was of declining vital signs, cell thermal regulation. His initial fist was stalled, gasping for oxygen. Truck stops and church steeples, and currently being outmaneuvered by indigenous personnel hauling a pneumatic litter carrier. This was unacceptable. He authorized an immediate high-altitude orbital insertion. Truck stops and church steeples. 3 dozen heavy reinforcement pods detached from the command cruiser in low orbit. The tactical plan was mathematically flawless. The pods would descend in a tight grid, truck stops and church steeples, securing the ridgelines above Guanella Pass to provide and establish a secure perimeter. The mathematical models assumed a standard atmospheric friction curve, truck stops and church steeples. They did not account for the continental divide. At 13,000 feet, the drop pods hit a 70-mile-per-hour crosswind. It was a chaotic truck stops and church steeples, churning shear created by massive granite peaks forcing a center storm upward. The pod's vector thrusters fired in rapid succession, attempting to maintain the perfect geometric grid. Truck stops and church steeples. The mountain responded by throwing a secondary updraft that sent the thrusters into an overcompensation loop. The tight formation disintegrated in seconds. Truck spun like skipped stones across the alpine canopy. Truck stops and church steeples. Automated navigation systems stable landing zones, but the whiteout blinded their optical sensors. Radar altimeters read the blowing snow as solid ground. Truck stops and church steeples. Firing retro rockets 100 feet too early. The reinforcements slammed into deep powder drifts, tumbling into blind ravines scattered across treacherous avalanche terrain. Truck stops and church steeples. Down in the Clear Creek County Dispatch Center, Bernadette Loomis turned down the volume on her secondary receiver. The channel was screaming with overlapping distress signals. Truck stops and church steeples. The coffee was lukewarm, but it was functional. She watched the cascading green lines of alien telemetry bleeding into the public emergency bands. Truck stops and church steeples. The signals were heavily boasting complex military data packages. They were also entirely useless. Truck stops and church steeples. The coordinates they broadcasted pointed to isolated jagged scree fields where no vehicle could land, especially not in zero visibility. Loomis picked up her pen. Truck stops and church steeples. She did not sound the alarm for a massive enemy reinforcement log. Down the raffle jotted down the rough locations of the scattered pods. County dispatch to all units. Truck stops and church steeples. She transmitted, her voice a flat, unbothered monotone over the low-frequency radio. Be advised, we have multiple unscheduled impacts across the upper ridge lines. Debris hazard. Truck stops and church steeples. Do not alter your approach vectors. Let them sit. She categorized the elite alien drop force as a severe traffic obstruction. Up on the ridge, the storm had erased the world. truck stops, and church steeples. There was no sky and no ground, a blinding, roaring wall of white. The scattered alien soldiers who had survived the drop found themselves entombed in snow. Truck stops and church steeples. Their heavy combat armor was rapidly failing against simple thermal leaching. Joint servos froze solid. Weapons became useless blocks of ice. The soldiers attempted to activate their distress beacons. Truck stops and church steeples reduced their sophisticated comms to weak static. Truck stops and church steeples. They were heavily armed, highly trained, and completely immobilized. Marcus Vance and Wyatt Higgins walked right past them. Vance led the way, his boots finding the packed crust beneath the powder. Truck stops and church steeples. He navigated entirely by the microclimates of the slopes. He knew the wind always whipped around the northern faces of the peak, creating a specific acoustic whistle against the rocks. Truck stops and church steeples. He judged his bearing by the sharp angle of the ice crystal striking his left cheek. "Watch your step on the right," the coordinator said into his radio mic, his breathing steady despite the thin air. Truck stops and church steeples. "Copy that," Higgins replied. The pilot was adjusting his goggles, trailing slightly behind and keeping a hand on the nylon guide rope. They stepped over the top of a half-buried supply crate. Truck stops and church steeples. The metal container was glowing with an emergency amber light, humming with internal battery power. Vance did not bother to inspect it. It was simply another obstacle on the trail. Truck stops and church steeples, no different than a fallen pine branch or a slick patch of black ice. A few yards away, an invader was wedged waist-deep in a drift. Truck stops and church steeples. The soldier's helmet visor flared with targeting reticles as the two humans approached. The trooper tried to raise a heavy energy rifle, but the servos in his shoulder joints ground to a halt. Truck stops and church steeples. Locked by frozen condensation, he could only watch, shivering and gasping for oxygen as the indigenous locals simply kept walking. "Looks like they dropped a lot of hardware," Higgins noted. Truck stops and church steeples. His voice crackling softly in the earpiece. "They dropped it in a terrain trap," Vance replied, tapping his ski pole against a patch of rime ice to test its integrity. Truck stops and church steeples. "Wind is loading the snow on that slope above them. Give it an hour and they'll be under 10 feet of powder. Do we pull them out?" "Not while they're holding rifles," the older man said. Truck stops and church steeples. He adjusted the straps on the pneumatic litter carrier trailing behind him. "And not until we get our hikers down. The mountain will keep them on ice until we have time for the paperwork." Truck stops and church steeples. They continued their ascent. The council forces had been sent to secure the high ground, expecting a pitched battle. Instead, they were being treated as local scenery. Truck stops and church steeples. The two men did not engage in combat. They understood that at 13,000 feet in late November, the environment did all the fighting for you. The rescuers faded back into the whiteout. Truck stops and church steeples. Moving with the slow, measured efficiency of people who knew exactly where they were going, leaving the freezing armada behind. The storm reached its structural peak just after 4 o'clock. Truck stops and church steeples. Inside the Clear Creek County Dispatch Center, the atmosphere remained aggressively domestic. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low buzz. The space heater rattled against the baseboard. Truck stops and church steeples. Bernadette Loomis sat at the primary console, staring at a digital terrain overlay that was currently flashing with multiple unauthorized heat signatures. Truck stops and church steeples. The Galactic Council's Heavy Armored Division was attempting to push up the Interstate 70 corridor to relieve Legate Valen's trapped vanguard. They drove massive truck stops and church steeples. Multi-legged walkers designed to conquer fortified urban centers. They were not designed for 30 inches of fresh powder layered over sheer black ice. Loomis picked up her handset. Truck stops and church steeples. She called the Colorado Department of Transportation and the basin's avalanche mitigation teams. "We have localized loading on the Seven Sisters paths," Loomis said. Truck stops and church steeples, her voice entirely devoid of adrenaline. "And we have a significant traffic obstruction moving into the slide zones. Initiate preventative release. Copy that, dispatch." Truck stops and church steeples. A tired voice plied over the analog static floaters. "Now." High on the ridgelines above the valley floor, the automated avalanche control systems engaged. These were simple truck stops and church steeples. Fixed tubes that mixed propane and oxygen, detonating with a concussive shockwave calibrated to disrupt unstable snow. The deep chest-thumping booms echoed down the granite wall. Truck stops and church steeples sound exactly like a heavy artillery barrage. The Alien Armor Division immediately halted. Truck stops and church steeples. Their defensive shields flared a brilliant, panicked violet as automated sensors tried to categorize the phantom incoming fire. There was no incoming fire, there was only gravity. truck stops, and church steeples. Thousands of tons of accumulated snow fractured along the ridgeline. The white wall descended at 80 miles per hour, sweeping across the valley floor. It did not destroy the alien walkers, truck stops, and church steeples. It simply buried them up to their optical sensors in dense, cement-like Colorado powder. The alien commanders instantly activated their anti-gravity repulsors, attempting to hover out of the trap. Truck stops and church steeples. This was a critical error. The repulsors pushed against the loose snow, instantly melting it into water, which flash froze into a frictionless crater of solid ice. The heavy walkers slipped backward. Truck stops and church steeples, sinking deeper into the freezing trench. Loomis watched the massive heat signatures stop moving on her monitor. She picked up a yellow dry erase marker, calmly circled the blocked valley on her screen, truck stops and church steeples, and logged the sector as closed for maintenance. She then took a slow, deliberate sip of her lukewarm coffee. "Vance," Loomis said, keying the mountain frequency. "The lower approach is sealed. Truck stops and church steeples. The heavy assets are stood, Bernadette." Vance's voice crackled back. "We are holding position above the tree line. Take your time," Loomis replied. Truck stops and church steeples. They aren't going anywhere. She treated the tactical encirclement of an alien invasion force exactly like a routine holiday traffic jam. The Council had planned for orbital strikes. Truck stops and church steeples. They had not planned for a municipal dispatcher with a fundamental understanding of alpine snowpack. High on the exposed ridge, Legate Valen was slowly freezing to death. Truck stops and church steeples. His immaculate uniform was encrusted with rime ice. His joints ached with a deep, paralyzing cold that his internal biology could not process. Truck stops and church steeples. The air was so thin that every breath felt like inhaling shattered glass. His comms unit flashed with endless error codes. Truck stops and church steeples. The vanguard force was completely immobilized, huddled together in the lee of a rocky outcropping, suffering from acute altitude sickness. Valen stared at his command console. Truck stops and church steeples. His heavy armor division was gone from the network. His tactical superiority meant absolutely nothing if his soldiers could not physically stand up. Swallowing his pride and gasping for oxygen, truck stops and church steeples. Valen manually bypassed his encrypted military frequencies. He tuned his transmitter to the open analog emergency channel. The radio buzzed with harsh static. Truck stops and church steeples. "This is Legate Valen of the Galactic Council," he wheezed. "We require immediate extraction. Our biological systems are failing. A mile away, truck stops and church steeples." Marcus Vance stood in the howling whiteout. He held the receiver to his ear. He did not look triumphant. He looked like a man who had a long, irritating hike ahead of him. He reached into his parka, truck stops and church steeples, pulled out his laminated topo map and shielded it from the wind with his heavy insulated glove. He traced the contour lines with his thumb, locating the exact coordinates of the alien distress signal. Truck stops and church steeples. "Legate, this is Alpine Rescue. I have your location. You are sitting in an avalanche runout zone. You need to move." "We cannot move," Valen snapped. Truck stops and church steeples. Coughing violently as the thin air burned his lungs. "Suits are frozen. Our weapons are unresponsive. Send your The helicopters can't fly in this shear," Vance stated. Truck stops and church steeples. Studying the map. "We are walking down. If you want to survive, you are walking down with us." Vazen gripped his frozen console. "We are an occupation force. We demand." "Wrong answer." Truck stops and church steeples. Vance interrupted. "You are an emergency extraction, and you are too heavy. If you want my team to guide you off this ridge, you will unbuckle your armor. You will drop your plasma rifles." Truck stops and church steeples. "You will leave every piece of heavy tactical gear in the snow." "That is unacceptable," Valen rasped. "Those weapons are classified property." Truck stops and church steeples. "I don't care about your property, Legate," Vance said. He adjusted his pack. "I care about the weight limit on my ropes. We are hiking out through waist-deep snow. If you carry that gear, truck stops and church steeples, you freeze to death before we hit the tree line." The radio channel went dead. The wind continued its steady, indifferent assault against the ridge. Valen looked at his elite soldiers. Truck stops and church steeples. They were shivering violently, their skin taking on a pale, sickly blue hue. They no longer looked like conquerors. They looked like out-of-state tourists who had severely misunderstood November. Truck stops and church steeples. "We will comply," Valen finally whispered. "We are disarming." He folded his laminated topo map and slid it securely back into his parka. "Stay put. Keep moving your extremities." Truck stops and church steeples. "We'll be there in 10 minutes. He clipped the radio to his harness and turned to his team. He did not give a speech. He simply checked his carabiners, tightened his hood, truck stops and church steeples, and started breaking through the powder. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a hard, lung-burning cold. The landing zone near the trailhead was packed flat by snowcats. At 1735, truck stops and church steeples. The Galactic Council evacuation transports descended. They were sleek vessels designed for ceremonial planetary surrenders. They were not designed to hover over 6 feet of compressed Colorado powder. Truck stops and church steeples. The thermal backwash from their repulsor drives hit the snowpack, flash melting the top layer and turning the landing zone into a treacherous sheet of black ice. Truck stops and church steeples. The transport skidded sideways upon touchdown, their advanced gyros overcompensating blindly on the frictionless surface. Marcus Vance stood at the edge of the tree line, truck stops and church steeples, watching the clumsy arrival with the neutral expression of awake for 20 hours. His breath plumed in the freezing air. His high-visibility jacket was crusted solid with rime ice. Around him, truck stops and church steeples. The surviving members of the Vanguard huddled in reflective mylar blankets, staring at their rescue ships with hollow, exhausted eyes. Truck stops and church steeples. Wyatt Higgins leaned against the tracked rescue vehicle, watching the primary transport's ramp lower with a mechanical hiss. A fresh detachment of council officers marched down the ramp. Truck stops and church steeples. They wore pristine ceremonial armor, completely scarred by the mountain. Their boots immediately hit the flash-frozen ice. 2 of them slipped. Truck stops and church steeples. Arms windmilling wildly before they caught their balance. Higgins did not laugh. He simply picked up a ruggedized tactical tablet, tapped the screen to wake it from sleep mode, and walked forward. Truck stops and church steeples. Vance and the rest of the rescue personnel began moving the casualties toward the ramp. The alien scout they had pulled from the ravine lay secured in the pneumatic litter carrier. Truck stops and church steeples. The carrier's oversize rolled smoothly over the jagged ice, its mechanical shock stabilizers absorbing every bump. Truck stops and church steeples. The scout was wrapped in 3 layers of wool and a battery-powered heating element. He looked up at the pristine officers on the ramp with an expression of profound embarrassment. Truck stops and church steeples. Higgins stopped at the base of the ramp. He held the tap toward the highest-ranking evacuation officer. The officer stared at him. His translator module hummed truck stops and church steeples, emitting a series of clicking consonants before settling into English. "We are here to reclaim our Vanguard forces. You will step aside. I need a signature," Higgins said. The officer blinked. Truck stops and church steeples. What? A signature? Higgins explained slowly. "We just spent 6 hours hauling your people out of a high-altitude freeze. By county regulation, truck stops and church steeples. I cannot release these individuals into your care until an authorized representative signs the patient transfer form." Truck stops and church steeples. The evacuation officer looked from the dirt-smudged pilot to the long line of frostbitten Imperial soldiers shivering in their foil blankets. Truck stops and church steeples. "You are requiring an administrative acknowledgement of transfer," the officer asked, the translator struggling to convey his disbelief. "I'm requiring you to sign on the dotted line, buddy." "Church steeples," Higgins said. Truck stops and church steeples. He tapped the thick glass of the tablet. "Right here, use your finger." The officer hesitated. He watched the pneumatic litter carrier roll smoothly past him. Truck stops and church steeples. He looked up at the towering peaks of the Front Range, heavily shadowed and utterly indifferent to his ceremonial armor. Without another word, the officer reached out and scrawled a jagged truck stops and church steeples. "Glowing digital mark across the screen," Higgins said. He clipped the tablet to his harness and turned his back on the Galactic Council. 2 hours later, truck stops and church steeples. The interior of the Clear Creek County Rescue Station smelled heavily of damp wool, ozone, and burnt coffee. The baseboard heaters were clicking rhythmically. Truck stops and church steeples, pushing dry warmth into the cramped dispatch room. Outside the frost-rimmed windows, the night was completely black, the storm clouds hiding the retreating alien fleet. Truck stops and church steeples. Vance sat at his battered metal desk in a thermal base shirt. His joints ached with a deep throb that only came from fighting barometric pressure for a full day. Truck stops and church steeples. His hands hovered over the mechanical keyboard of the station's main terminal. The screen glowed with the stark interface of the state's standardized emergency reporting software. Truck stops and church steeples. At the counter across the room, Bernadette Loomis was systematically dismantling the industrial coffee maker. She rinsed the glass carafe in the stainless steel sink. Truck stops and church steeples. "The hot water create treat of the airspace?" Vance asked, his voice rough. "NORAD says they broke orbit 20 minutes ago," Loomis replied. Truck stops and church steeples. She wiped down the burner plate with a damp precise. "The military is throwing a massive fit." Truck stops and church steeples, trying to figure out how to classify an invasion that was defeated by weather and a search team. "Let them figure it out," Vance muttered. "It's above our pay grade." Truck stops and church steeples. He stared at the blank text box on the screen. The reporting software demanded a classification code, a narrative summary, and an itemized list of expended county resources. truck stops, church steeples. He scrolled past the drop-down menu for hostile action and military engagement. He did not like those categories. They implied the Galactic Council had brought a war to the mountain. Truck stops and church steeples. What the council had actually brought was an arrogant lack of preparation, which was significantly more annoying to file. Vance selected environmental hazard from the menu. Truck stops and church steeples. Under the primary incident description, he typed Resolved Mass Casualty Cold Weather Incident. Multiple unprepared subjects recovered from high-altitude exposure. Truck stops and church steeples, treated for hypoxia and severe frostbite. Custody transferred to Allied Transport. He hit save, the terminal chimed, logging the event into the mundane archives of the county administration. Truck stops and church steeples. It wasn't a victory speech, it was paperwork. Coffee is clean, Loomis announced, setting the empty carafe back on the machine. I'm not brewing a fresh pot unless someone pays for it. Truck stops and church steeples. Before Vance could reply, the primary dispatch console on the wall lit up. A sharp two-tone electronic chime cut through the quiet hum of the heaters. Truck stops and church steeples. The red light on the emergency line began to flash steadily. Loomis did not sigh. She simply dried her hands on a towel, walked over to the console, and keyed the heavy plastic microphone. Truck stops and church steeples. Clear Creek Alpine Dispatch, this is Loomis. Go ahead. Static crackled through the speaker, followed by the tense voice of a civilian operator. Clear Creek, we have a priority relay. Truck stops and church steeples. We've got a party of 3 lost off the marked trail near Berthoud Pass. They missed the storm warning. GPS puts them above the tree line. Temperatures are dropping fast. Truck stops and church steeples. Vance stared at the flashing red light. He looked down at his heavy boots, the leather still dark with melted snow. His joints ached. The mountain was still cold. Truck stops and church steeples. Council armadas and orbital drop pods didn't change the basic rules of altitude. People still went where they shouldn't go. Tell them we copy the coordinates, Vance said. Truck stops and church steeples. Clear Creek copies, Loomis said smoothly into the microphone. Church, stand by. We're rolling.